Hello, historians. How's it going? So last time I lied to you guys and said that was the last video, but actually this is the last video of the year. So this is the review for the semester 2 exam. Remember that periods 1, 2, and 3 have their exam on Monday. Periods 4 and 5 have their exams on Tuesday. So the exam is 55 questions long, and there's two multiple choice, or excuse me, two short answer that you can just pick one from. The short answer will require you to cite text, okay? So there will be, sometimes I leave out that C part, the citing, but this time you will absolutely have to do that. One of your short answers is going to be over Manifest Destiny, and then one of them is over the Civil War. So be prepared to answer anything about those. All right, guys, well, let's get into this. Please let me know if you have any questions, and good luck studying. All right, so number one, the Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion in Western Pennsylvania over the tax on whiskey. And as we were talking about the beginning of the nation, we talked about how George Washington set a lot of precedents. And one of those precedents that he set was the creation of a strong national government. And this is an example of that because Washington sends troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. So that really shows the power of the government and how he will respond in situations like this. So that's the Whiskey Rebellion. We also talked about the first two political parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans are supported by Jefferson, and they favor a small government, and it's people like farmers support the Democratic Republicans. And then the other political party was Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, and he favored a large government, and he was supported by businessmen. If you guys remember, Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury, and he created the first national bank. When Hamilton and Jefferson were in office together, they were in Washington's cabinet, so they were some of his top advisors, and they did not get along and actually forced Jefferson to resign. So then we have the XYZ affair, which was a conflict with France. The French and British were at war, and the French started attacking some American ships. And so the Americans sent over some representatives to talk to the French about this, and the French refused to talk to the Americans unless they paid a bribe. And the Americans were so offended that the French would even ask them to pay a bribe. And so this actually leads to like kind of a war between the US and France. What's really interesting is this happens under John Adams, and this is as a result he creates the Navy, and so that's why we call John Adams the father of the Navy. So then we have the War of 1812, which is between the US and the British, and there's two reasons why it started. One was because the British were impressing or capturing and jailing American soldiers, and the other reason is that the British were giving guns to the Native Americans, and in turn those guns were being used, the Native Americans were using those guns to fight Americans in the Western Territory. So for both those reasons, the War of 1812 was started. The War of 1812 was fought mostly in various locations around the U.S. One of the important battles, being the last battle, was the Battle of New Orleans. And what's interesting about the Battle of New Orleans is that it was actually fought after the war was over. It was fought after the treaty had been signed. They hadn't gotten word yet, though, that the treaty had been signed. So that's kind of interesting about the Battle of New Orleans. It was a U.S. victory, and it was the last battle of the war. Three effects of the War of 1812 is that there was an increase in manufacturing. It made Western movement easier because there was less resistance from Native Americans in the West. And then there was a rise in patriotism. As a result of that increase in manufacturing, it leads to this thing called the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was a complete change in the way things are made. And as I described in class, it's basically from people making their own clothes to machines doing that. And so that's the best way to describe the Industrial Revolution. Some inventions that were created, the cotton gin telegraph, so on. So especially the cotton gin. I know the cotton gin's on your test. Louisiana Purchase was bought for $15 million from France. It doubled the size of the U.S. I can promise you this next question is on there. Marbury versus Madison established judicial review. And judicial review is the idea that the Supreme Court can review all of the laws that are made. And so this really equals out the three branches of government. So now each branch has just an equal amount of power. And then the last one was the Monroe Doctrine. And Monroe, this was his foreign policy. So this is how he was going to deal with other nations. And this was his policy opposing any European interference in Western Hemisphere. If you're confused about those, just remember those political cartoons that I showed you. And I think those give you guys a good representation of what that is. Okay, so moving on to Unit 7. Westward expansion. I do want to tell you guys that the map is on the test with each of the territories that we gained numbered, and there's some questions about that. Okay, so if you want to see the map, I can show it to you. Just email me. So how did Jackson give more people political power? Called Jacksonian democracy, expanded voting rights. Jackson also used the spoils system, which is the practice of giving political jobs to government or to supporters. And then the Indian Removal Act affected Native Americans because it made them leave their homes. And on that journey, it was called the Trail of Tears because it was a terrible journey and many people died. So let's skip number 5. I do not believe that's on your test. Number 6, the war with Mexico was fought over boundaries. This was the Mexicans versus the U.S. It ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. What's important about that treaty is that it gave the U.S. a bunch of land in the West called the Mexican Cession. A lot of people start moving west in 1849. They're called 49ers or prospectors. They move there to find gold. A couple movements to know is the abolition movement, which was the movement to stop slavery. Two of those famous abolitionists are Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And then during this time, Elizabeth Cady Stanton also leads the fight for women's suffrage or women's right to vote. What I told you guys in class, which is not on this study guide, is that you'll need to know manifest destiny. And that's the idea that Americans felt they had the right to expand from coast to coast. And that was fulfilled with the Gadsden Purchase. And you also need to know the Gadsden Purchase and that it was made because the U.S. wanted to build a railroad through that territory. Okay? So like I said, know that map. Okay? There's a lot of questions on that map with each of the territories that were purchased or acquired, and they're numbered, and then you have to be able to tell me things about that map. Okay? So moving on, the last unit, the Civil War, this should be a little more fresh in our heads. The North and South were very different. The North was seen as like more progressive, it was more industry, whereas the South was based on slavery, farms, and plantations. The Compromise of 1850 said California would be a free state. The Mexican Cession could decide what they wanted to be, free or slave, and it encompassed the Fugitive Slave Act. What's not on here, which you need to know, is that the Kansas-Nebraska Act, also another cause of the Civil War, said that people could vote whether they wanted to be free or slave states, and that's called popular sovereignty. Okay, so the Compromise of 1850, Missouri Compromise, Kansas-Nebraska Act, election of Lincoln, publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin, all of those are causes of the Civil War. And what I mean by that is those are all things that led to increased tension between the North and the South. So, and what's important about the Kansas-Nebraska Act specifically is that it said that people could vote whether they wanted to be free or slave states. Well, that voting leads to violence in Kansas. Okay, so that's why that's so important. Moving on, number 4, differences between the Union and the Confederacy. These are just the weaknesses and strengths. After grading your short answers from the test, a lot of you answered this one and did really well on it, so I don't feel like I need to review it. Moving on, the Union battle plan was called the Anaconda Plan, and that was to blockade around the South to prevent supplies from coming in. A lot of you guys wrote Total War, and that was Sherman's battle plan on his march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah. And what Sherman does on his march to the sea at the very end of the war, Sherman does this, and he uses Total War and basically destroys everything in his path, pulls up railroads, anything that the South might be able to use for the war, he destroys. So the first battle of the Civil War was the Battle of Bull Run, and the Confederacy won that. If you guys remember, the Union retreated, and the spectators got in the way on their retreat. During the Civil War, a battle was fought at Gettysburg, and when there was a memorial made at that site, Lincoln went there and gave a speech called the Gettysburg Address. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the South. Lincoln, when he was president during the middle of the Civil War, issues the Emancipation Proclamation. 3 Reconstruction Amendments. I promise you, you will need to know what each one of these did. 15 gave voting rights to African Americans. 14 said all persons born in the U.S. are citizens, and 13 abolished slavery. The period after the Civil War is known as the Reconstruction. This was a period of rebuilding, trying to rebuild the South. It was successful in some ways because these amendments were passed and African Americans held government positions. However, it was a failure because there was things like the Black Codes, which took away rights of African Americans. Alrighty, guys, please let me know if you guys have any questions. Like I said, it's 55 multiple choice, 2 short answer, 1 about Manifest Destiny, 1 about the Civil War. So good luck studying, and I will see you on Monday.